Greetings, everyone. I am very excited today to be in conversation with my friend and colleague, Jane Gleeson-White. We've been in conversation before, but a very different conversation about your international best-selling books, Double Entry and Six Capitals. But today we're going to be talking about your gifts and your experience as an astrologer. And let me just give a little bit of your background, Jane, and then we'll get into the conversation. But Jane is a writer as well as a very gifted astrologer with degrees in literature and economics and a PhD in creative writing and literature. And you really have explored such a variety of areas in terms of your writing and your research. But today we're going to be talking about this project you and I have embarked on, which is exploring these different paradigms and understandings of astrology from the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And we've gathered a group that's beginning to explore this together with many people from the Southern Hemisphere, some astrologers from the Northern Hemisphere, like me, and really trying to tap more into indigenous wisdom and more ancient understandings of the stars and planets and sky. But today, I'm really excited because we're going to be talking about your experience being on the land in Australia where you are and your experience of the sky and of astrology. So thank you for being here, Jane.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's such an honor to talk to you always. Yeah, you're an extraordinary teacher. And as I was saying just then, I feel that you're partly responsible for the most recent, iteration of my experience. Oh, you totally are of astrology. But yeah, thank you. It's a great honor to be here. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I honor its elders, past, present, and emerging. And this land is in Sydney, Australia.
Mm. So talk some about your journey as an astrologer and what's just been unfolding for you recently around this.
Yes, Heather. Well, I'll talk about what prompted this conversation, as in an aside I made in a conversation we were having, and then I'll go back to why I think, I have had this very somatic experience. Um, so in a conversation recently, I expressed my experience of being a Southern Hemisphere astrologer, or doing astrology in the Southern Hemisphere, but with Northern Hemisphere astrology. And let's just locate it in the Western European tradition, which then goes back to the Middle East and Babylon. And, so it's this ancient eclectic cosmology. And so I said to Heather and the group that my experience was, so I was born in autumn as a Taurus sun, but my experience of that Taurus sun has never resembled the so-called Taurian qualities of the Northern Hemisphere Taurian season of spring and deeply rooting and grounding in, our place. And it has felt much more scorpionic and much more, that penetrating. Anyway, I won't continue to describe myself, but I just could feel that I had this very muted experience of being a Taurus sun, and that was very different from the so-called Taurian qualities. And that has a number of possible explanations, but there seemed to be something much more fundamental there. And also because I knew a lot of Scorpio Southern Hemisphere people who seemed to be more Taurian in the traditional way of understanding Taurian, of, lovers of beauty and artists and, creating beautiful homes and food and all that kind of Taurian love of beauty. So I just made that aside, and that, you found that interesting because we're trying to explore the kind of merging of the polarities, or how the polarities feed into each other in some way or another. And it felt like I'd had this kind of more embodied sense of those polarities. So the Taurus and the Scorpio and you know, all of the other polarities, because our seasons are the opposite. So I am an autumnal Taurian, and you know, in Northern Hemisphere astrology, Scorpio is the autumnal opposite sign. So I don't know if you want to clarify anything that I just said then in that rush, Heather, before I go back to the beginning.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so what you know, I've been trying to ground this experience to make it really clear and very, it is a very personal experience, but I wonder if others have had it. So I started studying astrology because I was in crisis, and that's often why people do turn to such things. But my crisis was perhaps a typical one, which was that I had got married to someone that I loved. Actually, it was 33 years ago today by chance, but I had just got unmarried from somebody, and here I was back in what I felt, not intellectually, but you know, very experientially, as a kind of patriarchal institution that was somehow constricting me. I almost felt, you know, that I was suffocating, and it was nothing to do with my amazing husband, who I totally loved. Anyway, so it was maybe a psychological thing, who knows? But because of that, I became, and you know, at the time, so I've always worked as a writer. I was working in bookshops, and I was working as a freelance editor. And so this was all just on the side. And I had begun to be very curious about my body and my menstrual cycle, and, you know, in a bigger kind of what I would now call shamanic, thanks to Heather. But, you know, it was like I was inquiring into my own embodied experience as a woman. And as part of that, I found this extraordinary book called Shakti Woman. Oh, and the other thing I have to add to this is that I'd been reading. I'm a voracious reader, and I'd been reading all the sort of Western European psychology. I've been reading especially Freud and Jung, and arriving at Jung and, you know, reading his kind of definition of the feminine as this passive receptive thing, you know, it was very alienating for me as quite a fiery, you know, passionate, not at all identifying with that Jungian feminine at all. So I had all these kind of, you know, places that I didn't feel that I fitted. And mostly, I guess you'd call them patriarchal constructs. Let's not even call them institutions. And so Vicky Noble, the author of this book, Shakti Woman, at the time that she was writing it, was married to a Jungian psychologist. And he had the same view of women. You know, so he had this Jungian view of women, and yet, as Vicky said, but I'm his wife, and I'm this fiery double Aries, you know, passionate woman. You know, where do I fit into your kind of cosmology about women? Am I just like the fallen woman that you can make your wife, while there are all these other ideal women who, you know, you don't marry type thing? Anyway, and she would have such enraged conversations with him that one day she, you know, which precipitated this extraordinary dream where she just visioned the book that she would go on to write. So she speaks of this kind of disjunct that she felt between Jungian psychology, her husband, and her own energy, in ways that perfectly spoke to me. And she says that in her opening pages. So I bought the book and read it. And part of her reclaiming or claiming of herself as a woman that felt like herself was to look back to ancient wisdom traditions and try and piece together what law of womankind or, you know, mysteries were available in the sort of prehistorical cultures. And she writes about the tarot, she writes about the megalithic sites that Mary Gambutas was excavating at the time and writing about. And she also writes about astrology. And astrology was the one that just really spoke to me, because I've always loved the stars. I've always loved the sky. I've always loved it. It felt more me than the tarot. It felt more ancient and organic, maybe. But she also spoke about astrology, lunar astrology, and the lunar cycle. And that I also so resonated with, especially as a woman, with the menstrual cycle. And so her astrology, so she was sort of reclaiming astrology from its Greco-Roman kind of overlay, trying to look further back into those archetypes to a more women-centered, women-empowered version of those myths. And all of that really spoke to me. And so I thought, I need to learn astrology, and I need to learn it this exact way. And extraordinarily, I was in a bookshop one day at this time, and I had my hand on a table. And when I picked up my hand, I looked down, and under my hand was a leaflet saying, Moon-Centered Astrology course starting next week up the road, inspired by Vicky Noble or something like that. And I just thought, well, clearly I'm meant to do this course. And so I did. And the reason that's really significant to me is that I learned astrology in a really intuitive, somatic way. And the way that we were invited by this extraordinary astrologer, Cecilia Hutton. This was 1992. This was a very early iteration of this way of doing astrology. She invited us to tune into the lunar cycle and its, monthly rotation through the different signs, and to feel how we felt when the moon was in Aries. And was it true that we felt a bit edgy or whatever, or was it not? And, and then we'd bring our experiences to the group. And it was a very open group. I mean, we also learned to construct charts by hand with log tables and an international atlas and an ephemeris, which I also loved. And we also learned the traditional, what I would now call Hellenic astrological, wisdom, law, while also primarily tuning in to the cycles of the moon. And it wasn't just women, it was men as well. It was very inclusive. It was queer. It was in a neighborhood in Sydney, which is very radical. So it was so supportive, so open, and so intuitive and so somatic. And so I don't know if you want to comment on any of that, Heather.
Well, this is so beautiful. As you and I have talked about, it's Vicky Noble that led to my getting into astrology, a different path in that I was actively exploring the ancient sacred feminine wisdom from prehistory and Maria Gambudis's work and in women's spirituality groups. And Vicky was leading a workshop that I was in and just was offering to do readings on the side. And I had no interest in astrology at that time, but I thought, well, it's a new experience. So I had a reading with Vicky Noble that changed my life. I mean, it was so profound for me in that experience of her reading my chart and tuning into me at such a deep level with, this wisdom of astrology, that I started exploring astrology and never turned back. That was 1994, 95.
Yeah.
So,
Same.
but I think that's, this could be a whole other conversation that we have around our longing to reweave the sacred feminine wisdom with astrology, which is a core theme in my work in an ongoing way. But I think some of what is so profound about our movement into exploring astrology from that kind of perspective is that it was about embodying it. It was about being in tune with the cycles of the moon. And it's part of what led me into my own shamanic exploration of how do we come into relationship with an attunement with the energies of the planets in our own direct way, rather than it being all conceptual and intellectual. So, I mean, I think that's so profound that you entered into astrology from that experiential and embodied way of being with, which is much more like the indigenous experiences
Mm-hmm.
of understanding.
Yeah, and also just to add, when you were talking about the women's mystery, so I guess mine was more, as I thought at the time, but led to the women's mysteries, like a feminist kind of, but where do I fit in this marriage and this, I mean, trying to make a container for myself within a patriarchal institution, but in academia, all the things. And astrology, as you found, when you said you never look back, I mean, I found a note in my diary from 1993 the other day that said, I think I found the thing that can contain all my thinking, my very diverse thinking, as you know, because I have studied quite a few different things and written about a lot of different things, but it just has, this great amplitude, and also because it's always changing and it's about change. And that's also another reason that the moon was so beautiful, because it's constantly changing. It offers us the most beautiful wisdom about the phases and the cycles of our lives, to not get so attached to the the things that are here. And there's so much wisdom. I just want to go back to also the menstrual cycle, because the wisdom of that bleeding that we experience every month as women until menopause is, well, one, when I actually went to a big women's bleeding circle to really go into it. And of course, it's one of the last taboos, really. It really is still a taboo, women's menstrual blood, and it's been so vilified and demonized by some monotheistic religions. But there's a lot of potency in the fact that, for me, my own body was experiencing this same, growing and releasing, So again, that really embodied sense of cycles, literal cycles.
And that awareness that before we got disconnected from the energies of the sun and moon with all our electric lights, and that we as women our bodies were in tune with the lunar cycle, ovulating at the time of the moon, bleeding at the time of the new moon, and that was such a time to be going into altered states of consciousness, and as in the and there was the honoring of the dark of the moon, not waiting for the new moon, but honoring those 3 days of the disappearance of the moon, when we can tune in and gain this guidance and be in a deep meditative state as we're in our times of menstruation. And it's interesting, we're in this whole conversation. I, just to share a personal story, I had incredible difficulties with premenstrual cramps, intensely so, for years, until I started exploring this, started attuning to the cycles of the moon, started honoring being in relationship with the moon and her cycles, and the cramps disappeared. And I realized they were such a message to me of my disconnection, of my getting caught in that kind of driven lifestyle of you just override it, don't pay attention to your body. And I think I think her name is Laura Owens. Her blood is gold. And it traces back to how sacred menstrual blood was in pre-patriarchal times. So it's so interesting that we really were exploring our relationship with astrology in these similar ways.
Absolutely, and very somatic. And, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, well, that's actually very Taurian to be so embodied. But, so because because it was so experiential and so seasonal, so to go to really the essence of our conversation, when I was feeling into the solar zodiac, the signs, and learning that Aries is the first burst of life through the frozen ground, has all this effort, this is the first moment. And we see that in the Aries archetype. And then Taurus is the plant rooting and grounding. And then, the bees with Gemini, all the beautiful seasonal metaphors and images, which are what the Western tropical zodiac was based on. I mean, that's where astrological archetypes come from, the Northern Hemisphere seasons in the tropical zodiac. And, so then they were imported to the Southern Hemisphere, and we have just been practicing with those reverse seasonal, archetypes for however long we have. I mean, maybe some people have started to not practice in that way, but I'm yet to hear of them. Well, actually, there is one, and we'll get to her. But in other words, I always felt the autumnal nature of my Taurus sun, for example, and therefore very scorpionic, very wanting to, like explore the taboo, explore the menstrual cycle, do astrology while writing books about economics, and, like do all the things. And so it didn't really become, and the other thing I should add is astrology was it wasn't a secret because people knew I was doing it, but I never charged money. I always practiced it. So from the very, very beginning, people would come to me. I didn't even have to seek people. It was word of mouth. And I felt that I had such fluency in the language that it was like a gift that I didn't charge for. It was just a pleasure to do the charts, even in those days when it would take hours to construct a chart. So I've always, always, always practiced astrology for anyone who asks, although I've shifted that to charging recently. But I never really looked at my own chart. I was too busy doing other things, including being a mother and, having a career in other things. So I didn't live my chart, but I did continue to study, including with the Faculty of Astrological Studies, in London via email at the time. That was in the late 90s, early, because I was always wanting to kind of just explore more and really, kind of, I don't know, expand my actual intellectual content as well as this very deep somatic experience I had of it. And of course, the Faculty of Astrological Studies, which, is Liz Green and Howard Sass-Bortis, and it's very Jungian, it's very psychological astrology, and it's fascinating as well. And I loved their writing as well. And there's, so I began to realize there are so many different ways of working with these archetypes and reading charts. And, so I just need to add that. But funnily enough, it was when I started charging for astrology at my children's instigation, in 2022, because I was doing so many charts. They said, "Mum, you should be charging for this," which is very lovely of them. But I thought, well, I better bring my kind of formal qualifications up to date. And then I went to study with you in 2023. And, because I just didn't know where astrology was at in 2022 to sort of justify charging people money. And so I encountered Heather's course, which was, I think, 10 months long, certainly 9 months. And we had to work with our own charts, out and proud, on the screen. And I had never really paid attention to my own chart. I mean, I knew what my chart looked like. I knew what I had. I knew all the energies, but I didn't work with it. In fact, I almost probably hid from it, if I have to be honest. So having to confront my chart with you, and, the beautiful group that I was in was very confronting, and also very beautiful and very supportive. And I think it connected me to astrology in a much more personal, well, I know it did, way. But also at the time, I have to add that I was having pretty intense trauma therapy for, residual childhood stuff with an amazing therapist. And I had initially been drawn to Heather from your book, From Trauma to Freedom. And I had that as my Bible, because what you do in that book is bring together all the dimensions, all the practices. And I'd been doing all the things like yoga and this amazing therapy and, you know, sorting through my relationships and doing astrology and having the spiritual practice. And I knew that they were all critically important for this kind of healing I was doing. But not until I read your book did I realize how important, and that they were all necessary, and that they all fitted together in the beautiful practice you have of the medicine wheel, which I'd always resisted in other groups because it felt like cultural appropriation from a Northern American kind of tradition. I couldn't find an equivalent in Australia, and even then I would have probably been uncomfortable to do it. But the way that you wrote about it in that book and the way you practice it just made me feel comfortable in it, you know, with the arch model, which I don't know if you want to talk about, but it was so grounding. And before I stop, I just want to say that the reason it was so powerful, and particularly while this simultaneous thing was going on of having my chart suddenly exposed, it was like my soul was exposed, was that what your practice does is it allows you, and I was already doing this with my therapist, but not somatically, not in this way. I mean, yes, somatically in conversation, but not walking, not standing in the center. What your medicine wheel enables is to get to that centered witness self. And that is exactly the self you need in trauma therapy, because you have to find a place in you that can stand still while everything around you is in mayhem. And it's all your younger selves freaking out in utter terror. And not to get caught in that is a practice.
Well, and like you're saying, the medicine wheel is such an embodied practice and a ceremonial practice. So it's not about trying to find that sense of calm through your mind, but actually being embodied in it. And I think part of, it is such an ancient practice that's at the root of every spiritual tradition. So we can find our own, which that version is my own synthesis connected to my experience of the land and directions and sky where I am. We all can create that practice to be in our own experience of it. But
Mm-hmm.
part of what's so powerful about it, and it ties in with everything we're talking about today, it is about healing and coming into wholeness in a way that we're accepting all the parts of ourselves, just like we accept all those aspects in our charts, all that diversity. And the chart itself is a medicine wheel that ultimately we're meant to come to center where we align with the witness self and our soul self and realize this is my experience in this lifetime, but I'm a part of infinity,
Mm.
connecting to the earth and the sky, because the medicine wheel is actually a sphere with the earth below and the sky above. And then we're remembering we're part of this oneness of all that is,
Mm-hmm.
that's holding us in our journey and in our trauma. And we can then find that eye in the storm and
Mm-hmm.
the center. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So beautiful. So beautifully said, Heather. I can feel the calm of that. You know, I really don't think I ever had it before then. In fact, it might, you know, who knows what's going to come out of my mouth, but this is when I had been working with you for a few months. I went to visit my daughter in France in January of 2024, and she said, Mum, you're very different. I think it's since you've been working with Heather. And I went, I think you're right. But it was just the palpable, you know, stillness that I had already begun to cultivate thanks to that medicine wheel practice, you know, because it just brings everything together. And so honoring that, honoring my observant daughter, and honoring, my trust, I guess, in what you are offering, you know.
Mm. Well, thank you, Jane. I mean, that means a lot.
Mm,
Part of what I really respect about how you've done your journey, whether it's astrology and even with the medicine wheel, you really are honoring the land where you live,
mhm,
your experience of the sky. And it's so interesting that even with the medicine wheel, in the northern hemisphere, the orientation is to enter from the south, move around clockwise, which is the way you're energizing your experience of connecting to the directions and the wholeness. But in the southern hemisphere, you started to explore, I think I should enter from the north and that I should go counterclockwise because that's the energy here. And it was so beautiful. It really opened my mind to we have to be in our own experience of this
mhm.
and the way we're connecting to the energies of the land and sky where we are, not have this other template imposed on us, which is what happens with this way in which the northern hemisphere ways of doing things get imposed on the southern hemisphere.
Exactly, which leads us to the point at hand. And interestingly, as you say, it happened first with the medicine wheel, and it was an entirely somatic experience. One day, my body just went, no. And I think it was because I was comfortable enough. I think you can only do that if you're comfortable enough in a practice, as in you're healed, calm, whatever, enough to throw it all up, because that's your authority throwing it all up. Anyway, my body is usually my best authority, another Taurian quality perhaps, but it just refused and started walking anti-clockwise. And all of the rest of me was just panicking, thinking, no, this is where you release things. This is no, but I knew that that was nonsense, and I just had to pay attention to what was actually happening. And so that was the very beginning of this other huge kind of dislocation, let's say, or relocation, which was the astrological one. So I think that probably came, I don't know, maybe last year. And I said it to you because it was like, what? And as you do, just honored it as being true to my Southern Hemisphere experience. But then I was Googling to see what other Southern Hemisphere people did. I eventually found one. It was good to find that that wasn't just, I mean, I knew logically it wasn't crazy, but it was nice to find that there are other people in that place. But the extraordinary big thing that happened was not just me feeling a muted Taurus energy that felt very scorpionic and autumnal, but between the eclipses recently on the 19th of March, and only I feel because we had already planned this conversation, and you had sent me this article by Ema Kurent, a Slovenian astrologer, called The Forbidden Truth About the Zodiac, that she published in March 2022. And I glanced at it earlier, where she's mostly talking about the disjunct between the tropical and the sidereal zodiac. And that's the bulk of her article, which incidentally she couldn't get published into astrological journals. And she found that very interesting, as do I. But that she had an aside at the end, just a small paragraph called The Southern Hemisphere Problem. So obviously, which I hadn't read the first time I read it. And as I was reading it, where she talks about her early forays into, so to say again, the tropical zodiac is based on northern hemisphere seasons. So all the signs are signified by their relationship to the seasons, and including to the equinoxes and the solstices. So the 4 cardinal signs are the ones that move you across those great kind of transitions. So they are, Aries, Libra, Cancer, Capricorn, with all that energy. And then all the other ones fit, we don't need to go into the details of astrology, but she had begun to flip the chart to use the exact opposite chart for her Southern Hemisphere born clients. And she found that it was incredibly illuminating and much more instructive than their Southern Hemisphere charts, which still could explain some things, but not in the huge way that the Northern Hemisphere one did. And her main example was someone who was very theatrical and had been in theatre, and in Northern Hemisphere astrology had an Aquarius ascendant, and in Southern Hemisphere had a Leo. And so, but as I was, and I was thinking, oh, interesting, because I'd always resisted flipping it. I thought you can't just flip it for the Southern Hemisphere. But then, while I was reading this very brief paragraph, it was like time stopped, light flashed. I saw this vision, and I've never had a vision like this. My visions are usually more Neptunian. This was so Uranian. It was like vision in Technicolor of my chart, totally reversed, perfectly reversed. I could see it all illuminated, with a Scorpio sun. And, it was so clear and shocking that, I mean, I was actually quite unnerved, but also kind of excited. It was extraordinary. It was in the late afternoon. I had to go for a walk. I had to really calm down. And I was sort of excited because I like, new ideas and new things, but also I felt a bit scared of how weird that was. And that night I could not sleep. And it was as if, as I expressed to Heather, had literally been dislocated. I couldn't orient myself in my bed. I felt I was upside down. It was like I had completely spatially flipped, which was so extraordinary. And part of me was thinking, whoa, did I really so energetically and somatically locate myself in my Northern Hemisphere chart that when I see the flipped one, I'm at sea? Like, that was a shock to me that, because as I said, I've really only consciously been working with my chart since 2023. So it was so shocking. And then in the morning, after a fragment of sleep, my kind of rational brain was just going, well, this is ridiculous and it's impossible. And, the sun is where it is. It's in the, sign of Taurus, or, that's like a fact. It doesn't shift when you're in the Southern Hemisphere. But I couldn't unsee that vision. And I eventually told Heather. And then we both have been thinking about it. And there's an extraordinary Australian astrologer who I'd read, because this question has been with me always. It was one of the first questions I asked Heather. What about the Southern Hemisphere? And you were the first person to listen and go, yeah, that's a question. That was early in 2023 before I became your student. And so it had always obsessed me. And so I had looked, when I started studying astrology again with Heather, online to see if any other Southern Hemisphere astrologers were expressing this. And the only one I could find is another Australian astrologer called Mystic Medusa, who's a brilliant astrologer who's been working for decades. And she's also passionate about this subject. But so she doesn't do the flipped chart, but she does make very clear that in the Southern Hemisphere, we look north and see the sun rising on the, the right-hand side. And so our ascendant should be on the right-hand side of the chart, not on the left-hand side, which is fully the Northern Hemisphere vision. And so, she is fully aware, as I am, that we are trying to cram our Southern Hemisphere experience into a Northern Hemisphere perspective.
And think about that. Isn't this symbolic? That
Yes.
you and I are passionate about this in a number of different areas, but it's taking the visual and perceptual experience and somatic experience of those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, but saying, no, this is your reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as you were saying before we got on, it's another form of colonization.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
And it's then disconnecting us all from our own experience of reality. And I think as we're moving into the Aquarian age, it is about not only honoring diversity, but coming back to this deeper relational connection to the earth and sky and planets and stars instead of
100%.
an intellectual template that we all accommodate. But part of
Yeah.
what's powerful in what you're describing, and it's really amazing to think about it. I mean, for you in the Southern Hemisphere, your experience of the stars is a mirror inversion of what we see in the Northern Hemisphere. The sun and planets and stars of the zodiac for you are more oriented towards the north. So, like you said, the sun still rises in the east, but it goes from right to left from that perspective. In the north, we're looking south. So, the midheaven is the south. The ascendant is on the left side of the chart. Sun's rising in the east, but we're looking at it going from left to right.
Mm-hmm.
Also, for you, the movement of the houses then would start on the right and go clockwise instead of counterclockwise, which fits with the energies of how water moves and energy moves in the reverse directions in the Southern Hemisphere versus the Northern Hemisphere. So there's something about coming back to that lived reality of your perceptions of the energies and the earth and sky and honoring that and finding the way to really honor that diversity. It
Mm-hmm.
eventually, like we're talking about in our hemispheres group, it is about integrating the polarities, but it's not about negating the diversity of those different experiences
100%.
with where we are.
And the other thing, of course, that I just have to acknowledge is, of course, I'm living on stolen land where there's a 65,000 plus year star tradition, cosmology that is unbroken, which is First Nations Australian, because there's not just one Aboriginal culture, but many nations. And as we've also talked about, their cosmology is land, water, sky, all one thing, all connected, can't talk about one without the other. So you can't talk about Indigenous cosmology or Indigenous astronomy. And there are many young, brilliant Indigenous astronomers writing books about this without talking about country, water, everything, all the animals, all the people, all the rocks, everything, all one thing, interconnected, all speaking to each other in one big cosmological, organic, not even system, just presence. So there's so many different layers, and that's why I wanted to start very personally and with my own somatic experience, because that's all I can really speak to, because there's so much other wisdom waiting to be spoken or waiting to be heard, maybe from the Southern Hemisphere. But I do find it astonishing now that we can speak about this publicly that, I mean, definitely Mystic Medusa was writing this in 2020, but this has not been a question for Southern Hemisphere astrologers. And maybe it has, and I look forward to the rush of people going, yes, I've been thinking this, I've been practicing. Because, really, if I were to comply by the tenets of tropical astrology, which again, just to honor the fact that that is an abstraction as well. The wheel with its 30-degree houses, its 360-degree circle, that is all an abstraction from the actual sky. And you always honor that actual sky, Heather, in your videos with visual astrology. And, there is in Aries season, the sun's still in Pisces or, is already in Taurus or, so it doesn't necessarily correlate to the cosmos. But I mean, I feel that there's something plausible in Ema Current's argument that it's really about the seasons, so let's honor the seasons. I mean, that's how so the expression of Aries is the expression of spring. So maybe in the Southern Hemisphere, it is a time to start wondering, well, is our Aries much more Libran, because it comes at that shift into autumn. And how do we think that and speak that and write it and feel it? And I think that's where I'm at. So that flipped vision, which was so atypical for me, and it was like, excuse me, look, Jane, and then the rest of me will catch up slowly, with some logic and research and experience. But it is making me need to think again about the received wisdom of the zodiac. And I should also add that it became even more pronounced when at the big, or probably at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, I had my first students, just two, and unpaid, just, experimenting, giving that gift to them of astrology, and not even being able to, like wanting to say, actually, forget these Northern Hemisphere things. Let's try and feel into what it's like in the Southern Hemisphere. But I couldn't, because I was trying to teach them astrology, and I wanted to give them something that, they could kind of go away with and work with. But that's also when my head just began to resist. I couldn't parrot Northern Hemisphere astrology to Southern Hemisphere people, is basically what happened.
This is so beautiful and profound, Jane, what you're saying, and there's so many layers to it. And one of the things that you're saying that I think is so important, and I I am so passionate about exploring those ancient wisdom traditions from pre-patriarchal times. And there really was that more ancient understanding of heaven earth. We weren't caught in that duality of splitting the earth and sky. It was all part of the oneness, which we're moving back into now with quantum physics, with the paradigms, with moving into coming back into harmony and integrating the polarities. But we not only in the patriarchal period and in the age of Aries in particular started getting caught in those paradigms of separation, separating earth and sky. But we then did lock in our tropical zodiac chart in the age of Aries, tied to the seasonal energies and the equinoxes and solstices of that time of the age of Aries. So part of that disconnect, as you were saying, is our charts aren't even reflecting where the sun and the planets actually are now in the sky. And I credit my experience with Bernadette Brady, who came from Australia, was an Australian astrologer, now in the UK, for saying we need to reclaim the wholeness of the sky and actually look at where these luminaries and planets are located in the sky. So I think as we're moving into the age of Aquarius and reconfiguring astrology, we need to come back in to connection with the land where we live, our experience of the sky, and where these energies are in the sky, and step away from these templates that disconnect us from that lived experience. But how do we reweave our experience of the earth and the seasonal cycle where we are with the zodiac, with the sky, and come into some new understandings? Because I do think that lived experience of not only the lunar cycle and life, death, rebirth that we experience with that, but the seasonal cycle that guides us through the movement of the sun in relation to the earth are important aspects of astrology. But as you're saying, the Southern Hemisphere experience is not only weaving in the energy of moving into the time of darkness at the time of Taurus in the Northern Hemisphere, but as you and I have talked about, so the energies of light and dark get balanced when we really honor the experience of the Northern and Southern Hemispheres. And you and I have talked about how even our understanding of the constellations from traditions in the Northern Hemisphere come from the stars and connecting the stars into shapes. In the Southern Hemisphere, so many of the traditions are about the darkness between the stars. What are their shapes? So I think there's something profound as we're moving into the age of Aquarius with reweaving these very different ancient wisdom traditions coming from the two hemispheres and the very different lived experience of the seasonal cycle and the experience of the stars and planets.
Yeah, 100%. And just to add to that, the darkness, I mean, we have the galactic center in the Southern Hemisphere, this huge section of the Milky Way. And so it is so present that it's not surprising that that's been, the darkness has been what's been attended to here, the dark of the sky, as
And
well as the light.
and think about what that means in terms of also you don't have a clear, distinct pole star in the southern hemisphere like we have now with Polaris in the northern hemisphere. So you've got that dim star, Polaris Astrinus, is that it?
Mhm.
But you really are honoring the darkness at the celestial pole. It almost feels in some ways like the southern hemisphere has a deeper connection with source, the galactic center, the womb of the cosmos from which everything is birthed.
I mean, that's so interesting, Heather. What I'm really struck by as well, in terms of stars, is how much the Southern Cross calls me, and it's always present. I feel, if I have to think of stars that are my companions, it is the Southern Cross. And I was fascinated to find that Mystic Medusa also writes about the Southern Cross as one of her obsessions, and that in Peruvian, astronomy or cosmology, the Southern Cross is this portal. So, maybe that is more like Polaris, or more the kind of, guiding presence here, because it's very interesting that it's got such significance, and in First Nations Australian um, cosmology. So it just feels, I mean, I feel what we're doing today is just throwing everything up in the air. Or maybe we're doing more a version of, if this is not too presumptuous, Keone's, the phoenix gathering all the material of its nest and then sending it a light, because it feels like we've gathered a lot of material and we're, you know, who knows how it's all going to fit together or play out, or not so much fit together, I feel, but the speaking to each other and the listening. It feels, because I'm thinking now of the Aquarian age, and everyone in their unique selves together in community. And it feels, given it's an air sign, there's a lot of speaking going on and not so much listening going on, which is the other side of, communication. That's definitely a deep wisdom in First Nations Australia, that they've done a lot of listening, and now they want us to do a lot of listening, as in non-Indigenous Australians. So there's a great truth in that, I feel.
Oh, beautifully said, Jane. And I loved your description of this conversation, and it will be an ongoing conversation that we'll be having with the group and the others we're pulling into this exploration. But I think what you just said is so key, that that two things: that we need to listen. We need to be in this liminal time as we're moving out of the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, to be allowing the not knowing, to not be attached to the concepts and templates and paradigms of the past, to be open to the transformation and transmutation that we're in, to allow astrology to evolve with that, and to really come back into our connection with the earth and sky, our experience of them, and to listen to those energies, listen to each other, but also part of that course you were in that we explored together was, how do we listen to the sun and moon and stars and
Mhm.
planets and be in communication and communion with them so that they can guide us into these new meanings and new understandings and new ways of being with astrology. So
Yes.
it's a profound time that we're in.
100%. And that's really a perfect place to end, which I'm assuming you're about to do, Heather, because that is actually it. And I feel that that's what's been happening to me, that those voices have been entering into my field of attention. And also the plants, all the earth beings who have so much wisdom that we have forgotten how to hear, just to honor that connection as well. But yeah, thank you, Heather. That's a beautiful way of kind of bringing it together. Absolutely, 100%. Thank you.
No,
Honoring.
thank you, Jane. I so respect you and so respect your capacity to enter into this deep exploration, really listen to your own experience of these energies, and then your intellect and incredible ability to then research it, explore it into some new integration and synthesis. But you're really open and courageous about being in that process. So that's how your astrology started, and now how it's continuing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. I just want to say it's the courage of someone who doesn't know what they're doing. I mean, which I honor as well. I feel that's not bad energy to have right now. No, but knows. Yeah. Not to take away from it, as in, I mean, but you as well, just to be open to the new things, and the uncertainty, as you say, because that's really, that's where the courage is required, to be in the uncertainty.
But that's where the transformation happens.
100%.
Yeah. Thank you. To be continued.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was fascinating, as always. And thank you for all the work you do. This is a very precious channel for me, all your work. Thank you.
Thank you. And blessings and love to all of you. And we can't wait to hear your comments and your experience of this as we're exploring this in community together. So blessings to you. Blessings.
Thank you.